Good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here, and welcome to the National Gallery. Today we're continuing my annual Christmas Story and Art talk that takes place during the Christmas season. And normally, as those of you know who've been here many times in the past, this is a talk that's normally given in the galleries in front of the actual works of art, but over the years the crowds for this talk have grown to the point where it's now rather difficult to be in the galleries from the point of view of, first of all, just safety, and also for people to actually hear and see the objects. So this year all of these talks will be here in the West Building Lecture Hall at 1 o'clock. Of course, being in the auditorium looking at slides is not meant to be a substitute for viewing the original objects in the galleries. So I hope, obviously, that you'll go out on your own and seek out the actual paintings and spend some time with them. With that in mind, first of all, on the website where this talk is listed, all of the works that we'll be talking about from our permanent collection are on the website. You can just click on there and see everything that you'll be seeing today. And more specifically, during the course of the talk, I will try to remember to tell you the exact gallery number in which the works are located, and then you can copy those down if you want to follow your own trail. The last thing to mention is that normally when I've done this talk in the past in the galleries, at the very end, I would make reference to a piece of music that I think is an appropriate accompaniment to the talk, and I just would mention it and people would go off and seek it on their own. But now that we're in the auditorium and we're all comfortable, I'm going to play that excerpt at the end of the talk so that you'll know exactly what it is that we're referring to. So let's get started. And this talk involves, of course, images that relate to the Christmas story. And when artists began to approach the story as a source for paintings and sculptures and various and sundry other forms of illustration, they had certain sources, obviously, that were the most important sources from which these stories derived. So let's just mention briefly what some of those sources are, because we'll be coming back to them repeatedly. Obviously, the most important source for stories about the birth of Jesus, and at least the infancy of Jesus, is the Bible. But in fact, when you go to the Bible and you go to the New Testament, there are only two evangelists that tell us anything about the infancy or youth of Jesus, and that's Matthew and Luke. It's not mentioned at all in the other Gospels. And then even in those two Gospels, the evangelists don't tell the same stories. So for example, in Matthew we have the story of the Magi, the wise men. We don't have that story in Luke. In Luke we have the story of the shepherds, the announcement to the shepherds, the adoration of the shepherds, but we don't have that story in Matthew. So one has to go between the two Gospels to fill in that blank. So in essence, the Bible wasn't, the New Testament at least, was not a sufficient source. So there were other sources that artists drew upon, and one of the most important was the New Testament Apocrypha. So what this refers to, as you probably know, is the fact that there were a number of Gospels that were written over time. There was a kind of a discussion about which Gospels should, as I like to say, make the cut as comprising the New Testament. So we have the four so-called canonical Gospels that we're all familiar with, but there were Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, the infancy Gospel of James. There were a host of other Gospels that didn't make the cut. These were referred to as the Apocrypha, but artists knew these stories. These stories were pretty popular, even though they weren't in the canonical Gospels. So that's an important source. Another important source, getting again sort of further away from the Bible itself, were the writings of saints. And for our purposes, I think three saints are particularly important, the writings of St. Jerome, St. Francis, and St. Bridget of Sweden. So those three saints will figure prominently in terms of the stories they tell that then sort of seize the imagination of artists. Then we go to yet another source, and this is what we might refer to as popular legend in literature. And I think one particular source in that realm is of importance especially, and that's Jacob Varagine's book called The Golden Legend. The Golden Legend is a kind of compilation, almost like an encyclopedia, that tells the stories of the lives of the saints. And that it was compiled and written somewhere between 1260, 1275. In fact, it went through many different sort of editions. The Golden Legend is a very important source for for images that relate to the Christmas story, but even beyond that. And then we get to the fourth sort of, or at least to the last category that I just call, for the lack of a better term, maybe folk tales. And these could be popular folk tales. And these are things that continue to accrue in the story, the Christmas story, right up actually to the present day. And the example I always give is the little drummer boy. He wasn't there, but now that's a nice story, and that's become part of the sort of the Christmas story. So among and between all of those different sources, you see artists who try to give sort of visual life to the story of Christmas and to the life of Jesus as a baby and of his birth. So let's start with one of the most important paintings we have at the National Gallery, and this is in gallery number 1. So it's the very first gallery. By the way, all the images we're showing you, all the objects, are in the West Building that you'll be seeing today. So this is gallery number 1. And this is the painting by Duccio. It's the Nativity with the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. Dates between around 1308 to 1311. Duccio is a Sienese painter. He's from Siena. And this is a panel that is detached, dispersed, from a much larger famous altarpiece that's still in Siena today called the Maestà. The Maestà was a gigantic altarpiece made up of many separate panels. It was an altarpiece that was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who is the patron saint of the city of Siena. And what happened over time is that some of these panels were, as we say, dispersed. They left Siena and went in various and sundry places. And in fact, at the National Gallery, we have 2 of the panels today. I'm only going to show you this one that pertains to the Nativity and to the Christmas story here. Now here what we have, this painting is filled with multiple stories, multiple narratives between and among the 3 parts of it. So in the center we have the Nativity. Here's the Virgin Mary, the reclining. Here's Joseph, the Christ child, the ox and the ass. That's the sort of standard cast of characters, but we have here also embedded in this central scene other moments in the story. So we have multiple narrative here. And on the right side, we see the angels coming down to announce to the shepherds, who are down here, the birth of this child. So that's a different moment. That is certainly canonical. That's in the gospel. Then we have down at the bottom here, and I'll show you some details in a second, a scene of the washing of the Christ child. After his birth, he's washed by these midwives. That is not canonical. That's nowhere in the canonical Gospels of the New Testament, but we'll talk about where that comes from. So those are 3 stories right there. And then we have, flanking the main scene, we have the saints, Isaiah here on the left and Ezekiel on the right. There are 3 scrolls in this painting. Each of the prophets holds a scroll. And then there's a scroll that's being held by the angels as they come down to announce this event to the shepherds. Now, you may have noted here that we have Old Testament and New Testament together. So the prophets are Old Testament. They are not in the New Testament. The nativity scene, obviously, is New Testament. So what we have here is a very important concept that artists partook of, and that was very much common throughout the Middle Ages and even later into the Renaissance, and it's what we call a typology. And a typology simply means that very often in paintings, of this period, there was the desire to link the events of the New Testament with the events of the Old Testament, that the Old Testament in some way presaged or prophesied the events of the New Testament. So how would that play out here with the presence of Isaiah and Ezekiel? Well, you have to go to their scrolls here, which we can read. And because this is a Western painting, it's not an Orthodox, it's not an Eastern painting, the scrolls are in Latin, they're not in Greek. And when we look at Isaiah's scroll, which we can read pretty clearly, it comes from Isaiah 7:14, and that is where Isaiah writes, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." That was always seen as a prophecy of the birth of Jesus. So that's the scroll that he carries and what it says. On the far right, we have Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's scroll pertains to Ezekiel 44:2. And in that passage, we read this: "This gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no man shall enter by it, because the Lord God of Israel has entered by it. Therefore it shall be shut." And as I like to say, I get it, it's shut. And so what that is a reference to is, of course, Mary's virginity. No one's getting through that door except God. So that's what's on this scroll here. And both of these were seen as, again, sort of presagements of the birth of Jesus. The scroll that the shepherds carry, or that the angels carry, that they're announcing to the shepherds, is, of course, also canonical, and this is Luke. And this is Luke 8 through 11. And I'll just read it now because we're going to be coming back to this repeatedly. So in Luke 8 through, chapter 2, 8 through 11, we read, "Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord.'" Now, all of that is not written on the scroll, but the important part is when the angel says, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people." That's what's on the scroll. So that is canonical. That is in Luke. So we have this typology, and then we find a scene in the bottom, which is this washing of the Christ child. And that subject is not in the traditional four Gospels. That comes from the Apocrypha, and it comes from the Gospel that is known as the Infancy Gospel of James, that tells the story. It's a 2nd century document that tells the story of events from the life of Mary. And what essentially the story is that when Mary is close to giving birth, Joseph, who you see over here, decides that it might be a good idea to call in some help. And so he asks 2 midwives to come to assist in the birth. One of the midwives is actually named Salome, according to the scripture, but it's not the Salome of Herod, obviously. And then they stick around after the birth, and they bathe the child. So that's essentially, that comes from the Infancy Gospel. Now, artists love that story. And the reason they love that story is simply because it confronted them with a lot of interesting formal aesthetic problems. First of all, you had to probably depict a naked baby, which is a challenge, and a baby that's somewhat lively and maybe turning and twisting. Sometimes you had to depict water. These are elements that artists felt challenged by, and so this was a story that they gravitated towards for a number of reasons. Now, as I mentioned to you, Duccio is a Western painter. He's Italian. He's from Siena. His great counterpart in Florence would be Giotto, and the 2 great traditions in this sort of what we might call late Gothic proto-Renaissance period in Tuscany especially are these 2 traditions, Siena and Florence. each dominated by one of these painters. In Siena, throughout Italy in this period, but especially in Siena, there was a lingering of the influence of Eastern painting, the Byzantine tradition, which was strong throughout the peninsula, but it continued to linger and be perhaps more relevant longer in Siena than perhaps it did in Florence. And that leads us to some other elements that are in the depiction of the Nativity here by Duccio. First is, well, let me go through and show you some. When you look at the setting for the Nativity, in the Western tradition, the Nativity takes place in a stable, right? That's what we all know. In the Eastern tradition, though, it doesn't take place in a stable, it takes place in a cave. And so Duccio doesn't want to offend anybody, so he puts the stable in the cave. So everybody's okay with that. That's not a problem there. Now, the other thing you notice in our picture is that, of course, Mary, what we're very often used to in the depiction of the Nativity is Mary kneeling in devotion. Joseph kneels on the other side of the manger, and that's a very standard portrayal. That comes much later, and I'll talk to you about the origins of that. But in this case here, what Duccio shows us is not Mary kneeling, but Mary reclining. And that's very unusual, and it's particularly unusual in the Western tradition, because in fact it doesn't come from the West, it comes from the East. On the right, I'm showing you a Byzantine icon. So that's a Byzantine painting on the right. In fact, in full disclosure, it actually postdates the Duccio, but it's okay because this tradition is long established. And you'll notice that the Virgin reclines on this red kind of sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, mattress, sofa here. You see the Christ child wrapped in swaddling. You see the ox and the ass. And this is, of course, a cave. So all of that is the standard Eastern tradition. Now, what the Eastern tradition dealt with by having Mary recline is this idea that is not particularly shocking, that after you give birth to a child, you probably need to recover and recuperate and rest. And so this idea of Mary reclining, recuperating, resting after childbirth is an Eastern tradition. It comes into the West. Duccio certainly partakes of it. This is one of the very last times you'll ever see it in Western painting. This is going to ultimately change to the more traditional poses that we're familiar with, where Mary and Joseph kneel by the manger in prayerful devotion. But I'll explain how that comes about in a few seconds. So there's that element. Notice Joseph, poor Joseph, is he's always kind of pushed off to the side. He's kind of on the periphery of things, on the perimeter. Of course, we have a concept here of what's called hieratic scale, which is an old tradition that the more important you are, the bigger you are. So Mary is bigger than Joseph, Joseph's bigger than the midwives, etc. It's a kind of a ranking of your status. Here's the washing of the child, the detail I just mentioned, that again does not exist or does not come from any canonical source, but comes from the infancy Gospel of James. And then I'm showing you just a detail on the right of the Annunciation to the shepherds, where the angels announce to the shepherds that this child will be born. We've looked at the prophets here, and here they are in sort of close-up. One of the things you have to remember when you look at these panels that are from a dispersed altarpiece is that originally they were part of an ensemble. Now, sometimes we know what that altarpiece looked like. In fact, sometimes various exhibitions, depending on the number of panels, we might reconstruct the altarpiece, and every museum that has one of the panels will loan the appropriate panel, and we can reconstruct it. That would be a feat with the Maestà, because there were so many panels. But in any case, the fact that this panel has to be seen in the context of other panels, and in the case of our painting, this was what was known as a predella panel. It was at the foot, at the base of the front of the altarpiece. And there was a painting on this side off the screen. So in terms of Isaiah, he looks out of the painting, which is unusual, right? The reason he looks out of the painting is because if you reassemble the Maestà, The painting that would have been here that he would be looking at was the Annunciation. So it makes perfect sense that here he is with his scroll prophesizing the birth of Jesus through Mary, but of course the Annunciation is that moment when this is announced to Mary. So that accounts for his particular pose, looking out of the painting. If we move from Gallery 1, we pass through Gallery 2, and then we go into Gallery 3. And in Gallery 3, which still is Siena, it's dominated by Sienese painting, we see this wonderful painting, The Annunciation and Expulsion from Paradise, from 1435 by Giovanni di Paolo. So now we have a new story. So we just looked at the Annunciation to the shepherds, angels telling the shepherds there'll be this birth. But of course, before that is the Annunciation to Mary herself. And this is canonical. It's in Luke chapter 1, lines 30 to 33. And it reads, "Then the angel said to her, 'Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end.'" So that's the passage. That is now the source that artists are looking at, literary source, biblical source. It's canonical, it's Luke. And that gives rise to all of these images in the Christmas story that relate to the Annunciation. But in our painting, there's something else, as you could see by the title. It's not just the Annunciation. It's also another scene on the far left over here, which is the expulsion. That's an Old Testament subject, Genesis. So now we have, again, a typology. We have an Old Testament subject that is in some way related to the New Testament subject. Now, with Isaiah and Ezekiel, that's pretty straightforward because they're scrolls and they're literally tell us what the relationship is. Maybe this is a little less obvious. Anybody want to tell me why these two scenes would be together as a typology, the expulsion and the Annunciation?
Sure, because Christ is supposed to come and wash away all the sins.
Absolutely. The way I like to put it easily is, if this hadn't happened, we wouldn't need this. So, with the expulsion, with original sin, of course, we need to be redeemed, and that redemption is going to come with the birth of Jesus. So that's the Old Testament, New Testament typology that plays out here. And in fact, if you look carefully at the expulsion side and at God up here in the heavens, he's not even looking down here at the expulsion. This is the angel that's driving Adam and Eve out of the garden. He's looking all the way to Mary. So, of course, sometimes as part of a typology, you'll see Mary referred to as the new Eve. So that kind of typology plays out as well. So these two scenes are almost always linked together. But there's more going on in this painting because, again, there's the central Annunciation scene. Then there's the expulsion scene on the left as we look at it. And then there's another scene on the far right. So it acts almost like a triptych, even though it's all within one panel. And that's Joseph, good old Joseph, who seems to have gotten kicked out of the house. But now he's seated in front of a fire, warming his hands over here. Now that's interesting. And that when we put these three elements together now, we probably have something else going on in terms of the meaning of this picture. But let's sort of break it down step by step. Here are details of the angel and of Mary. Now, the angel arrives and sort of lands, and he has his hands crossed over his chest, which is a symbol of humility in front of Mary. What's interesting is that even with that, he actually, because he stands and she's seated, his head is actually higher than Mary's. But Mary echoes that pose with her hands across her chest, and that is a typical pose of humility, Mary's humbleness, her humility. Mary's body language in scenes of the Annunciation varies. And in the 15th century, especially in Florence and in Siena, especially as a result of Franciscan teachings and preaching, there was significance to how Mary looked, whether she had her hands crossed or opened, et cetera. And I'm going to sort of take us through that in a second. But in any case, she's clearly here in a pose of humility. She wears her traditional blue. We'll talk about color symbolism in a few minutes. But what might be going on here is something that relates to the calendar, the calendrical nature. This painting might have a calendrical nature, which relates to the idea of how is it that we decided that Christmas is on December 25th? Who came up with that? That's not in Scripture. There's nowhere in the Gospels where it says that December 25th is the birthday of Jesus. And in fact, if you try to extrapolate from the Gospels the birth of Jesus, more than likely it would be in the spring, because in Luke 2:8 is where we hear about the fact that the shepherds were out watching their flocks by night. You don't keep your flocks out in the wintertime. They're all corralled where it's warmer. And when you have your flocks out in the fields, it's in the spring. So if we were to extrapolate from Luke, then that would be a spring birth. Now, over time, this date of December 25th is what we now accept, and I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. But in any case, this painting probably is an illustration of the acceptance and a kind of reference to that, insofar as on the left side, where we have the expulsion, we have this garden, and this garden is blossoming and blooming, and it's got little bunnies running around, and everything is fecund and fertile and coming into new life, as in the spring. When we come to Joseph on the far right, he's warming himself in front of a fire, which would mean it's colder, fall, winter. What this painting may be serving as is a kind of visual calendar of the 9 months of pregnancy that take us to what was then believed to be the birth of Jesus in December. See what I'm saying? From spring through. So that may very well account for what you see here. And people would pick up on this. They would know that you didn't have to be a theologian to sort of understand this. So let's look at a few details. Here are the details I already made reference to. Sienese painting, Florentine painting at this time, again, this is sort of in the proto-Renaissance. You see them, you see Giovanni di Paolo certainly trying to understand perspective here, things like that. I'm not going to be talking that much in this talk about formal innovations and things, because we have plenty to talk about just with subjects. Here's the expulsion. There's old Joseph warming himself. This is a beautifully painted picture. It's not very large. It's fairly small. Here's the fecundity of everything. The hares, I said bunnies, but they're hares. And then the flowers blooming on the right. Angels are important, and they're a very important part of the Christmas story, as we all know. Angels have a whole hierarchy, and it's sort of like being in the military. You're at the high rank, and then you go down, and there are nine ranks of angels, and they're divided into clusters of 3. So let me kind of just illustrate this for you. This is a painting on the right by Francesco Botticini. It's in the National Gallery in London. It's to the Assumption of the Virgin from 1475. I'm not going to go through all the iconography of what is depicted here. It was a painting commissioned by a Florentine civil servant who's down there kneeling, but we're more concerned with the depictions of the angels, because he shows us in the sky here this sort of hierarchy of angels. Although it's interesting in this picture because he actually embeds the saints with the angels. That's not common. There are a number of saints he embeds in the ranks of the angels. But taking the sort of ranking, this is what I'm showing you on the left, this chart here. At the very top, these top 3, that's one grouping. These are the counselors. So in the realm of the counselors exist the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. So at the highest level, I guess the sort of 4-star generals are the seraphim, and then you got the cherubim, and then you've got the thrones. Then you come to the middle level, and collectively the three in the middle are known as the governors. And those are the dominions, the virtues, and the powers. And then you come to the third level, the lowest level, and those are the ministers. And those consist of the principalities, the archangels, and the angels. You know in the Messiah, that line where he says, and he shall be known as Counselor, right? Okay, that's a reference here to what we're talking about. So this is the ranking, this is the hierarchy, or sometimes I call it the batting order. Each angel, each rank of angel has a different kind of function or purpose. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one we're most concerned with in any depiction of the Annunciation is who is this angel and what does he do? And this, of course, is the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel, where does he rank? Well, he's actually an archangel. So he's he's kind of at the bottom of the ranking. In the Catholic tradition, there are three archangels. There's Raphael, Gabriel, and Michael. In the Judaic tradition, there are 7 archangels. They perform one particular task, and that is they are the messengers of God. So when God wants to communicate with us, he sends one of these archangels. And Gabriel gets a lot of business going out and giving messages. They might be good messages like the Annunciation. They might be like it's the apocalypse, whatever. But he's one of the most important messenger angels. And that is who we see repeatedly in the depictions of the Annunciation. His body language might change. He might be standing, he might be kneeling, whatever. But that's who the angel is. And so angels themselves have this rank. Now let's get back to Mary for a second. And I mentioned to you that in this portrayal, Gabriel comes, he has his hands across his chest, he's standing, he's making this announcement. Mary, in essence, echoes his pose with her hands across her chest. She is seated. But this is a pose of humility, or to put it another way, it's a pose of submission. And by that we mean it is submitting to the word of God. This is not something Mary anticipated. So this angel is bringing an important message that she has to kind of get her mind around, shall we say. Now, you don't just immediately say, okay, great, that's good. I love it. Okay, let's move on. You go through a state of, wait a minute, what are you telling me? And maybe I should think about this. Do I really want this? Maybe I'm not worthy of this. This kind of thing. So that leads to what in 15th century especially, theology thought, especially as promulgated by the Franciscans, were what we call the 5 laudable conditions of the Virgin Mary. So I've pulled these images out of 5 different paintings, in case you're keeping score. It's Botticelli on the left, Filippino Lippi, Alessandro Baldovinetti, Melozzo da Forli, and then at the far right is Antonello da Messina. But except for the Antonello, everything on the other 4 are just detail. I just pulled out the image of Mary, not the angel. So this idea that there were these 5 laudable conditions of the Virgin Mary in the Annunciation is reflected in her body language. And each different pose that could be depicted by an artist would be depicting a different state of mind within the narrative of this Annunciation, of this announcement. So the first one that you see on the far left, which is one of the most beautiful, that's Botticelli, is what in Latin was called conturbatio, but we would just translate it into English as disquiet. You're a little bit agitated, disquiet. And this is when the angel just like blows in, and here he is, and my gosh, what's happening? And in the case of Botticelli, very often he shows Mary actually shrinking back. Like not only is this a surprise, it's almost a shock. And not only that, but the angel almost seems very often to have like a physical force, like a wind that's coming in and she's sort of moving back. Botticelli favors this type of Annunciation depiction because he loves creating this balletic, dance-like, beautiful, sinuous kind of curve. So that's the first laudable condition. Mary's a little bit taken aback. In the next image, That's the one by Filippino Lippi, is cogitatio, cogitation, but in English we would probably say maybe reflection. Okay, the angels come, here's the news. All right, let me think about this. So Mary puts one hand up to her chest, the other hand is open, right, and down. The way I like to think about this with the hand up to the chest is, in essence, Mary saying something like, "You mean me? Like, do you have the right person? Do you have the right address?" So there's that kind of reflection. So that's also, she's kind of taken aback, okay, I got to process this. And then we come to the third pose, which is interrogatio in Latin, which we would call inquiry, or maybe questioning, interrogation. Now she goes on the offensive. Okay, here he is, he's giving me this message. Well, now wait a minute, I've got some questions for you. So now she's kind of gesturing in a more forceful way. She sort of collects herself, and now she's saying, okay, wait a minute, let's back up. What are you telling me? And this, so she's in the sort of interrogation phase. After all those three states, those conditions, she gets it. And then she decides, oh, okay, I guess this is destined by God. And that is the fourth pose that we've already seen in the Giovanni di Paolo, and that is the pose of humiliatio, humbleness, humility, but also submission. Now she accepts it. And of course, anybody know the line in the Bible that will refer to that in the gospel? Where she says, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord." Now she's on board, okay? So that's that. Now the fifth one is interesting because it actually is divorced from the actual events of the narrative of the Annunciation. It shows Mary afterwards, and almost always she's shown with a book. Not always, but almost always. And she's in this submissive pose again in terms of her acceptance. But it's not just about submission, it's about now what's called meritatio, merit. That in fact she merits this event and this episode. So that's the sort of culmination. These states of so-called laudable conditions were very well known, and when you would look at Annunciation, you could see the variations. So we just talked about it in relationship to Giovanni di Paolo. Let's go into the next room, and we would be in Gallery 4 now. And we look at the painting on the left, and this is our painting by Masolino da Panicale, a Florentine painter who worked in the Brancacci Chapel with Masaccio. This is his Annunciation from about 1423-24. I'm just bringing in a painting on the right by way of comparison because I want to make a point about it. That's a Botticelli. That's the Botticelli Madonna and Child that we have at the gallery from 1470. I'll come back to that, though, in a second. But let's talk about now the Masolino, because in the Masolino, we have essentially the same situation that we just had. The angel comes and announces to Mary that she'll bear this child. This time the angel is kneeling. Last time he was standing, now he's kneeling. So now there is a additional humility on the part of the angel. His head is a little bit lower than Mary's head, but he's in the same pose as in the previous picture, this pose of humility with his hands over his chest, but Mary's pose is different now. Now Mary isn't in the pose of humility. Now Mary has one hand over her chest, and then her other hand is open down to, of course, a book. So now we are dealing with this sort of cogitation, thinking about this, ultimately leading to interrogation, right? So that's what we have going on here. So this is a different Mary than the previous image. She wears the same colors. Her colors, we'll talk about color symbolism, are blue and red. And in different traditions, the Eastern and Western traditions are different. In the Western tradition, Mary usually wears a red undergarment and a sort of a mantle and then a blue cloak over that. And in the Western tradition, the blue is very often symbolic of spirituality, the heavens. Red is more about the material nature of the earth, the more temporal material things. Also, red relates very often to the passion, to the blood of Jesus. So that's the way we tend to see it in the Western tradition. The Eastern tradition actually sometimes flips it. Mary wears a blue undergarment and a red mantle over that, and the colors just switch. It means the same thing, but blue is the earthly color and red is the spiritual color. So that's in the often in the Eastern tradition. In any case, she's in this beautiful space. We were talking about how Giovanni di Paolo was attempting to sort of deal with perspective. That's even more evident here now, because now we're in the 15th century in Florence. So we've moved away from Siena in that kind of proto-Gothic period. So here, Masolino is really attempting to understand scientific perspective. He doesn't get it right. There's, in absolute one-point linear perspective, everything would converge at one point. That's not the case here. We have varying recession and vanishing points. We'd have to be very low to be looking up under this vault, for example. At other places, we're at eye level. But in any case, that's aside from the story here. Mary is seated, wears her traditional colors, but then her left hand comes down to the book. And now the book is important, because if Mary has the book, that means she can read. She's not just some uneducated peasant woman. She's educated, she can read, and that means she can read the word. She can read the book. And if you look closely enough at the type, at the script, which you can do with your naked eye, we can see what the book is open to. Anybody want to take a guess? Isaiah. It's a typology. It's open to the line in Isaiah, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child," right? So that's another actual small typology, Old Testament prophecy foretelling of the birth of Jesus that Mary, through the vehicle of the book. So this painting is now, again, a sort of different state of Mary, where she is a little bit more active as opposed to just being humble and submissive. But then there's one other element here that people always sort of graft onto, and that's why I brought in the Botticelli, because you can maybe see it a little clearer. On this blue cloak is a gold star. So everybody always asks, what's going on with the gold star? It doesn't mean, well, I guess it is kind of like a merit. The gold star refers to an aspect of Mary that accrues over time, and it relates to Mary as the star of the sea, is the English. But in Latin, that phrase, star of the sea, would be what? Yeah, Stella Maris. Right. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a couple of different things. First of all, Maris and Mary, there was probably a mistranslation along the way somewhere that is responsible for this phrase. But star of the sea, of course, relates to Mary now over time. She's the star of the sea, being the protectress of people at sea. And part of that relates to an early concept with the rise of Christianity, and that is to say that for most of the Israelites, as this new religion was starting to take form, Christianity, for most of the Israelites, those people were out to sea. They were not on the territory. So in one sense, they weren't true believers. They were doing something else. They were out to sea. And if they were out to sea, in that literal sense, then Mary would become their protector, right? So what Mary is as an intercessor, she's a guide, she's a protectress to the early Christians who are at sea, shall we say. But that leads to a more literal concept, protecting people who live off of the sea or are somehow engaged in the sea. And one group, obviously, that pertains to are fishermen, right? They earn their living from the sea. It's very dangerous to be a fisherman. If you go to southern France or Italy or to southern Spain, you go to just walk around various ports, especially fishing villages, and look at everybody's boat. Almost all of them are named Stella Maris, because for the fishermen, they take Mary as their protectress, as somebody who will protect them. So that relates, that emblem is the star that she has on her cloak. That relates to that status as the Stella Maris. Now we come again to one of the most, actually, almost every painting I'm showing you here from the National Gallery is a major, major painting, but this might be even more major. And this is the great Tondo that we have that depicts the Adoration of the Magi by both Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi. Fra Angelico probably laid out this picture. We think he just painted the image of the Virgin Mary, and everything else was done by Fra Filippo Lippi. I don't have time to get into their interesting, they were both monks. Fra means brother. One was Dominican, one was Carmelite, both Florentine. Both favorites of Cosimo de' Medici. This is a Medici painting. It's one of the most important Medici paintings anywhere in the world. And it has an impeccable provenance that we can trace back to the Medici. It hung in the Medici Palace, and on and on and on. That's another story for another time. But in any case, we haven't seen this story yet, the Adoration of the Magi. So this is canonical. Comes from Matthew 2:11, and it reads, "And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh." So that's the canonical source. And that's what Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi and everybody else who paints this story is sort of drawing upon. Of course, the Fra Angelico, which is a tondo, it's a round picture, round pictures were not meant for churches. They were meant for private residences. So this did hang in the Medici Palace. There's a lot more here than just the Magi, but here are the three Magi coming to pay their respects to the Christ child being held by Mary. This is Joseph. It's a round picture, so it has a beautiful movement of this procession of people around the perimeter and then sort of gorging out here and gorging out here to down here. One of the best figures in this painting, and I'll show you a little bit closer detail, is this poor lady over here. She's kind of has her hand up to her head like she's got a massive headache, and she can't keep it straight because she's got these two bawling babies who are clinging to her, and she looks like, oh my gosh, you know. And also it's like, and we're so far back in line. You know, we got to go all the way around. You know, so that's a marvelous figure. In any case, here are the Magi. The word magus in the singular is not Greek, it's not Latin, it's Persian. And magus means scholar. So that's why they're the wise men, they're scholars. Now the three Magi is what we always talk about. Nowhere in Scripture does it say there were three. That just accrues over time. And in essence, whenever the church has a problem about numerology, you know, how many people, how many this, how many that, 3 is a good number because 3 is symbolic of the Trinity, right? So, okay, we don't know, let's say 3. But in early Christian imagery of the Adoration of the Magi, sometimes you see a whole football team of Magi. I mean, there are like 10, 11, 12, 13 who are paying their respects. Ultimately, it becomes 3. Now, this may also relate to a theological concept, a Christian doctrine about the nature of Jesus. It's often called the 3 offices of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ had or fulfilled 3 offices, sort of responsibilities, and those were as priest, prophet, and king. And so the 3 elements, priest, prophet, and king, get reflected perhaps in the number 3 for the Magi. Now, often the Magi represent 3 different ages. So you have a very young one, a kind of an adult one, and then an older one. Sometimes those ages reflect emotional or personality traits. The young one symbolic of enthusiasm. The adult or middle-aged one of reasonableness or rationality, and then the old one reflecting experience. So sometimes you see the Magi that way. Sometimes they represent 3 different geographic locations in the world. So one is European, one is Asian, and one is African. So that's another variation that you'll see. I'll show you an example of that as we go along. This painting, of course, as I said, has a lot going on. There's one other element of the adoration of the Magi that's very important, of course, and that is the star, right? This is what guided the Magi. They followed this star, and that led them to the child. And when you look at the Fra Angelico, there is no star anywhere in the painting. That seems to be a rather important absence. But then you find this guy in red. There he is. And the implication on Fra Angelico's part is that he sees the star. He's looking up at the star. So the implication that the star is visible is subtly rendered by Fra Angelico by having this figure look up. And he's in this bright red tunic. So he's very noticeable. Here's the comparison of Fra Angelico's Mary versus Fra Filippo Lippi's Joseph. Fra Angelico is, of course, is legendary, is his devotion. In fact, he was beatified. He's on the road to sainthood. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II. So in Italy, he is referred to as Beato Angelico, beatified. So he got jumped over by John Paul and a few other people who became saints ahead of him. But he's been waiting longer. But he got pushed back in the line. Now here, you see another element that is always part of the nativity or the adoration, and that is the ox and the ass inside the stable. So here's the ox, here's the ass, again over there. Now, obviously, this is a stable, should have animals, so you see animals, and sometimes it gets really kind of crazy. It's like a menagerie, you got a camel, you got this, you got that, a lot of things. But almost always you have an ox and an ass. And so the question is, where did that come from? Why do all of a sudden do we have these two animals as protagonists? And there's nothing in the New Testament that says there was an ox and an ass. But believe it or not, there is something in the Old Testament that does refer to this. And believe it or not, it's in Isaiah. So we go back to Isaiah. It's Isaiah 1:3. And in Isaiah 1:3, what it says is, quote, "The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib." So that's in Isaiah. So what does that mean? The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib. Well, people came to interpret that. The ox knows its owner. The ox recognizes the status, the sanctity of Jesus. He accepts this child as the Son of God, that concept. The ass, its master's crib. Crib is another word for, another term for manger. In the manger normally is food. That's the purpose of a manger, would be to feed animals. And the ass knows its master's crib. If the ox is aware of the sanctity of this child, the ass is more concerned with the crib where the food is and is eating. So what you see very often then in the iconography is what exactly we have here. The ox is looking at the Christ child, very aware that this is a special child, while the ass chomps away in the manger, is eating. And in fact, in portrayals of the ox by various artists, most especially Botticelli, painting that we have, that I'll show you in a second, sometimes the face of the ox is so beatific, it's so beautiful, it's so human, it's so tender, that the ox seems almost to beyond, it's beyond just awareness. It's like he has a sort of beatific vision almost. And the ass just continues to chomp away. Now that ends up sometimes having a sinister connotation in history, and that is to say that the ox knows its owner, that's the faithful, the people who accept Christ. The ass, its master's crib, that's the infidel. Who doesn't accept Christ. So over time, that can actually have, that concept in Isaiah can actually be read as a somewhat sinister concept. Here's a detail, because there's so much going on in this picture. So showing you here just some details that people always point to and want to know what's what. First, of course, going up here, where this crowd is descending, as I showed you, and they're coming through this Roman arch. But this whole building this fortification is crumbling. This is a standard kind of reference to the fact that with the birth of Jesus is the end of the pagan world. So the pagan world, the classical world, the world of Greece and Rome is crumbling with the birth of Christ, which will supplant it. Then you have those really interesting semi-nude characters, these little boys who are on either side of this parapet. Art historians have written a lot about this. There's a lot of different takes on this. They occur in a painting by Michelangelo, the Doni Tondo, that's in Florence, on an opposite side of a wall of a parapet. And this is, by the way, a painting Michelangelo knew because he lived in the Medici Palace later in his life. So he saw this painting every day. In any case, some people interpret these boys as some on one side of the wall are still pagan, some on the other side of the wall are accepting Christianity, or as all neophytes in sort of accepting Christianity, that kind of idea. It goes in a lot of different directions. Then we come to all the birds, and the most notable bird is this peacock that is on the top of the stable. That's an easy one. The peacock has a long history of iconography and symbolism going back to antiquity, when it was a sign of everlasting life, because in antiquity it was believed that the flesh of a peacock never decays even after death. And all you had in Christianity was taking that peacock and now saying everlasting life in Christ. It just sort of gets morphed onto that. So the peacock has that significance. But then we have these two other birds on top of the stable down here. And one is a goshawk and the other is a pheasant. And here, without getting into all of the history, these are Medici symbols. The feathers from both of these birds appear in various Medici escutcheons and coats of arms. This was a further way of firming up the Medici connection of this painting, that it had a Medici connection. And the best article to read about this is one I always refer to because it was written by a very good friend and former colleague, Russell Sale, who used to be one of our senior lecturers. In 2007, he published an article in Burlington Magazine. In fact, he got the cover of the magazine. It was called Birds of a Feather, the Medici Adoration Tondo in Washington. And it was Russell who sort of researched this picture and came to the conclusion, quite accurately, I think, that all of the birds in this painting were added later. And they probably were not done by either Fra Angelico or Fra Filippo Lippi, but they were probably done by a third painter who was at that time at work in the Medici Chapel in the Medici Palace, and that's Benozzo Gozzoli. And in fact, when you look at this picture, those birds look like they were almost cut and pasted onto the surface. They actually distort the perspective. In Russell's article, he had a digital recreation of this image, removing the birds. And you'll see how it makes much better sense. So that's an interesting, if you want to, rather than me going through all that, I would just recommend that article. Now, once we pass through, that's Gallery 4, Room 4, and we go off into Room 7. Room 6 is where the Ginevra de' Benci is, but we're passing through that room. And going into Room 7 is this adoration by Botticelli. So again, another adoration scene. This adoration scene with the Fra Angelico and the Fra Filippo Lippi, that's a painting commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, one of the great patriarchs, founding members of the family, if we skip past Giovanni de' Bici di Medici. In any case, his favorite painters are Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi. But now we go generations ahead, and Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi are no longer with us. We have a younger generation of Medici in power, and these are the sons of Piero de' Medici. So it's Cosimo, Piero, and then we have Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano, their brothers. So their favorite painter is Botticelli. So now, just like their grandfather had commissioned the great adoration of the Magi, Botticelli is commissioned by the younger Medici to do another interpretation. The connection of the Medici to the Magi is very important for the Medici. The reason we have so many Medici pictures of the adoration of the Magi is because they saw themselves as the Magi of Florence. We bring gifts to the city, we bring prosperity, status, prestige to the city of Florence. We endow the city, we patronize the city. We bring gifts, all of this kind of stuff. The most important feast of the Magi, the Feast of Epiphany, is January 6th, which is also the Feast of the Magi. It goes by either title. And in Florence, there's always a procession through the city to celebrate this holiday. It follows the same route today. If you're in Florence on January 6th, the procession takes place. It goes the same route. It always passes the Medici Palace, where the Medici could look down and watch the parade. But more than that, members of the Medici family usually dressed up as the Magi and were in the parade to further cement this kind of connection. Even more so, Lorenzo de' Medici, we know, is born on January 1st. We know that. But he changes his birthday to January 6th to connect him more firmly to the Magi again, even things like that. So here we have, to that extent, in these adoration paintings by Botticelli, very often one hopes to find the portraits of the Medici as the Magi. We lose out in our painting. They're not portraits of the Medici, but the version of this picture, another version painted by Botticelli at the same time, that's today in London at the National Gallery, does have, in fact, the three Magi as the Medici: Cosimo, Piero, Lorenzo. So you have the three generations. Ours are not like that here. This takes place in a temple, but it's a classical temple, but the temple is crumbling, just like the parapet we just saw in Fra Angelico. And again, Botticelli knew that Fra Angelico painting upside down and inside out. So this is crumbling, the stonework is crumbling, weeds are growing. It's the end of the pagan world and with the birth of Jesus, the advent of the Christian era. Here, everything on this side of the painting is dying. Everything on this side is blossoming. So through this child, we have entered a new era. This has perfect, beautiful, one-point linear perspective. Nothing here that's sort of intuitive as we had with Masolino. It goes straight back to vanishing point. Then we find within this classical temple these trusses, three of them. Each truss has three beams, and within each of the three beams are three other supporting trusses. So in case you're missing it, it's 3, 3, 3. So that's the Trinity times 3 here, represented through the architecture. Of course, this is the implication of the stable as well. Not a classical temple, but of the stable. So there's that implication of the birth there. There are other things here, but most interestingly is for our story is what's in the foreground that almost nobody would look at, or that you would think it's just a normal, natural part of the landscape. It's these rocks. In the foreground, this is the access we have to the painting, visually. So visually, we have to walk through that path to get to the Christ child, or vice versa. And instead of having it as an open, with no obstacle path, we have these rocks that are just right there in the center. Now, for Botticelli and an Italian, this does seem somewhat natural. Like, okay, you got a landscape, you might have rocks. But in fact, probably here there is a reference here to something, and this gets us now into the writings of the saints. And probably here the reference is to St. Jerome, to the homilies of St. Jerome. And St. Jerome writes in one of his most famous homilies the following sentence or phrase: "Now the stones that he bids us throw out from our way are our sins. Christ does not walk in our heart if there is any sin there. He stumbles at once against these stones." Now, what you start to see in pictures, it's even more pronounced in Northern Renaissance painting. You'll see a scene of the Nativity or the Adoration or whatever it might be, and right in the foreground there's a pile of rocks. Even if the scene takes place in like a palace and it looks very clean and everything is well kempt, all of a sudden there's a pile of rocks. You would think, well, maybe the maid missed those or something. So you clearly know it's right in the front, it's right there, it's not accidental. And what it seems to be is a reference to this homily by St. Jerome. We can't make it to Christ if we carry sin, because trying to make it to Christ with sin, we will stumble, because sin is like stones, and vice versa. Christ can't make it to us either, because he'll stumble on the stones. So sometimes they're not as big as these stones. These are more like maybe boulders. Sometimes they're just a little pile of stones, but in any case, that's probably what's going on here. Again, I mean, so many of these paintings are among the most important we have at the gallery. This is moving from Tuscany to the Veneto and to Venice to Giorgione. This now takes us into room or gallery number 10. And this is the Giorgione Adoration of the Shepherds from 1505. A couple of things going on here that are interesting, some variations on what we've already seen. When we looked at the Duccio, the shepherds in that picture, if you'll recall, that was the Annunciation to the shepherds, right? When the angel's telling the shepherds about this event. Well, then the shepherds go to seek out this child. And once they find the child, we have a different episode, and that is the adoration of the shepherds. Now they kneel and adore the Christ child. That's what we have. That's what we have here. So they're two different events, and they're two different scriptural moments. They're both from Luke, but they're different moments in this story. Now, just to be comprehensive, Giorgione knows that these two stories go together, but here you've got to look very, very closely, because way up here is the angel announcing to the shepherds this event. So he has both stories here. This is the Annunciation to the shepherds. This is the adoration of the shepherds. Okay? So he wants you to know that they kind of go together. But what is the passage? It's just further along in Luke. It's Luke 2:15 through 20, where we have this. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, "Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which is come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us." And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all they that heard it wondered at those things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these things, and pondered them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen, as it was told unto them. So that's the actual adoration passage. By the way, and you probably already know this, all my translations, I'm using the King James Version because I think it's one of the most beautiful examples of the English language. So that's where I'm drawing these, my translations from the King James Version. So now we have a couple of things going on here. First of all, this is Venetian, it's not Tuscan. So we're in the Veneto. And this scene takes place in this most beautiful, pastoral, idealized landscape. It's, of course, it's exactly what you never find in Venice, because they don't have a landscape. So they walk out of their door and they fall into a canal. And in the Venetian tradition, there is this longing for landscape that gives rise on the part of Giorgione and Titian, the Bellini and others, to these beautiful passages of landscape, which are often referred to as Arcadian. They seem to relate even to Roman poetry and Roman storytelling. So there's all that that's always evident here. This is a gorgeous landscape off to the left. Here is the nativity along with the adoration, but it doesn't take place in a stable. It's a cave. Now, this is totally appropriate for Venice, because Venice is the most Byzantine city in Italy. It has a connection to the East. This would not fluster anybody in Venice that we have this depiction in a cave. The ox and the ass are back there. The ass is chomping away, and the ox is looking up. Above them, we see these little golden disembodied heads with wings. Those are cherubim. Those are the second rank below the seraphim. Cherubim are almost pure disembodied light. And the way artists tend to show them is by little baby heads with wings coming out of the heads, no bodies. And here, that's what you see. Cherubim, cherub, of course, relates to child. So they're often shown as children. The term has reference both in Aramaic and in Hebrew, the tradition, the term itself. So there is that element. Now we come down to the shepherds, and we only have two shepherds. That's unusual, because normally the shepherds are the mirror reflection of the Magi. 3 Magi, normally 3 shepherds. And what it speaks to, the Magi are kind of, the upper class. The shepherds are really us. Basically, we are to identify more with the shepherds. We're the common folk, right? And normally there are 3. And normally with the shepherds, it's just like the Magi. There's a young one, a middle-aged one, and an old one. And I'll sort of come back to that in a little while. Here we have 2, so that's an exception. But then we have something else that's different here. In the passage that I read to you, they find, according to Luke, they find the child in a manger, right? Well, there's no the manger here has got food in it. Doesn't have the Christ child. He's on the ground. That's new. That's significant. What you begin to see now is the portrayal at the nativity or the adoration, not of the Christ child resting in the manger, but of the Christ child literally either on the ground, maybe on a little cloth that's on the ground, maybe on a cloth on a rock, as you have here, or maybe sometimes just on a little bit of the dress, the garment of Mary, as a little bit of a kind of cushion. Now, what's going on here? Well, it's probably another theological writing and writer, and that is now St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis begins to, in his sermons, stress over and over again the humility of Christ, that this is the humblest and the most sort of poor and child with no sort of exalted sort of status in terms of where and how he operates. At one point in a very famous St. Francis sermon, he says this. He says, quote, "Every day he humbles himself just as he did when from his heavenly throne into the Virgin's womb. Every day he comes to us and lets us see him in lowliness when he descends from the bosom of the Father into the hands of the priest at the altar." So that's St. Francis, stressing this, everything that child's doing is coming down to us, so it's humble. And then you start to see this kind of portrayal. In other words, for St. Francis, putting Jesus in the manger would like be putting him in a 5-star hotel. He should be right on the ground. Now that's going to get reinforced by one other theologian, or not a theologian, but a writer. And that's going to be St. Bridget of Sweden, but we'll come to her in due course. Now, Francis is important for another reason in telling the Christmas story, because he is the originator, the instigator of another tradition that's part of the Christmas story, and that is the creche, the creche scene. So the way that even today we continue to have a creche scene with statues of the major protagonists, etc. Some of these are incredibly beautiful, created by very important artisans, especially in Italy and Naples. In any case, where did that come from? Well, that comes from St. Francis. St. Francis creates the first creche, but it's not a creche composed of statues. It's a living creche where he actually uses real people. These are not statues. These are real people. And the story of Francis and the first creche takes us to this town that is just outside of Rome called Greccio. And when this is a place where Francis had a hermitage, he was going to preach midnight mass at the hermitage in Greccio. It was anticipated that many, many people would come, more people than could be accommodated within the hermitage itself. So he moves the crowd out into the fields, which have some caves and grottos. And he decides to create a living creche. And that he does by simply looking at everybody. Okay, you're going to be Mary. You're going to be Joseph. Anybody got a baby? Okay, there's the Christ child. Let's go get an ox. Let's get an ass. Let's bring them all here. And he creates a living tableau, a tableau vivant. That's the first creche. Now, this is a scene in Greccio today. Starting in 1972 in the town of Greccio, they began to recreate this St. Francis living creche. They have real people in the countryside on especially Christmas Eve, but it runs longer than that. People dress up. In fact, they get their costumes from the Rome Opera House. And they dress up in period dress. You might see Aida one day walking by. And then you visit Greccio, and you make these 6 stations, excuse me, and you see each sort of tableau. And this is one here. It's very devotional, it's very moving, it's very, very, very beautiful. That started in 1972 and still goes on today. What's the story of the creche? Well, let me read it to you, because Francis's first biographer is his great sort of younger successor, and that's St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure writes the first biography of St. Francis of Assisi, and it comes out in 1263. Francis died in 1226. But in 1263, Bonaventure publishes his biography, and he tells about this story specifically. This is where we get it from. And he says this: "It happened in the 3rd year before his death that in order to excite the inhabitants of Greccio to commemorate the nativity of the infant Jesus with great devotion, St. Francis determined to keep it with all possible solemnity, and lest he should be accused of lightness or novelty, he asked and obtained the permission of the sovereign pontiff." He even asked the Pope if he could do this. And the Pope said, "Sure, go ahead." Then he prepared a manger and brought hay and an ox and an ass to the place appointed. The brethren were summoned. The people ran together. The forest resounded with their voices. And that venerable night was made glorious by many and brilliant lights and sonorous psalms of praise. The man of God, St. Francis, stood before the manger full of devotion and piety, bathed in tears and radiant with joy. The holy gospel was chanted by Francis, the Levite of Christ. Then he preached to the people around the nativity of the poor king, and being unable to utter his name for the tenderness of his love, he called him the Babe of Bethlehem. That's St. Bonaventure telling the story of the first living creche created by St. Francis. Now, there are 2 other things in this passage that are significant for the Christmas story. He says brilliant lights and sonorous psalms. We've got the trifecta, everything for Christmas. You got the lights, you got the music, you got Jesus, you got the whole 9 yards right here with St. Francis. Also in Gallery 10, room number 10, is another Venetian painting that's in the same room as the Giorgione. And this is Carpaccio's Flight into Egypt from 1515. This story is canon, it's canonical. It's in Matthew, chapter 2, 13 to 14, and it says, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, 'Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him.' When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt." That's the canonical source in Matthew for the flight into Egypt. The flight into Egypt is canon, and you see it depicted over and over and over again, both in the north and in the south of Europe. What is not canon, but becomes almost as often represented, is something we're going to look at in a few minutes, and that is the rest on the flight into Egypt. That somewhere, obviously it was after 3 days, the family decided to stop and have like a little picnic and then get back on the road. That is not canon. That is apocrypha. But that story also will become popular. But here we have the more traditional canonical source in Matthew of the rest of the flight into Egypt. Again, we have that same bucolic pastoral Venetian landscape that really doesn't exist. The thing about this painting that I love, that I often mention, is there's a kind of what I call, if you play poker, you know about a tell. If you look at another player and they're sort of scratching their ear or something, that means they have a good hand or something. And in this case, it's this brocaded garment that Mary wears. This is a poor carpenter family. They don't have a lot of money. And she wears the most gorgeous, beautiful brocaded garment. And of course, that has nothing to do with this story. That is all about Carpaccio. That is Carpaccio saying, look how good I am. I can take this, because the Venetians have a love affair with oil paint. We're getting ready to do a big Tintoretto show. And the Venetians love oil paint. And so he can't, I could put her in burlap, I could put her in something like that, but I really want to show you what I can do. And that's what that passage is all about. This is one of the most important paintings in the story. and one of the most beautiful and one of the largest that you'll find at the National Gallery. And this is particularly beautiful now because we did a big Piero di Cosimo show just a few years ago, and it was cleaned for that exhibition. So this is by Piero di Cosimo, Florentine painter around the time of Leonardo da Vinci, called The Visitation with St. Nicholas and St. Anthony Abbot, from 1489 to 90. This is in gallery number 19, if you're keeping track. The Visitation, we haven't seen this story yet. And this is in the Gospel, it's canon. It's in Luke chapter 1, 39 to 43. And it reads as follows. Now Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste to a city of Judah, and entered the house of Zacharias and greeted Elizabeth. And it happened when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary that the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Then she spoke out with a loud voice and said, Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? That's Elizabeth asking. Now what we have here, Elizabeth and Mary are cousins, and Mary comes, she's much younger than Elizabeth. Elizabeth is elderly, she's years beyond the childbearing age. Mary comes to visit her. Mary is already pregnant with Jesus. When Mary comes to seek out Elizabeth, they meet, and that meeting is symbolized right in the center of the painting by the hands. You see the beautiful difference in the way Piero treats the face, this color of the skin, the wrinkles, this sort of waddle that she has under her chin in Elizabeth. All of that is gorgeous. In any case, there's this greeting, and as soon as this greeting takes place, Elizabeth feels a child move in her womb. She's pregnant. And of course, she's pregnant with who? John the Baptist. So they're cousins. They will be cousins. And of course, this begins this linkage between the Baptist and Jesus that will continue throughout the Bible. And in fact, to the extent where people think that the Baptist is the Messiah, and they ask, are you the Messiah we've been waiting for? And he says, no, it's not me, it's he who comes after me. And then what is the first story in the New Testament where all four evangelists tell the same story, finally? Anybody know? The adult baptism, when John baptizes Jesus. That story, all four evangelists tell. That's significant. So all of that is sort of spun off of this particular event here, with Elizabeth now feeling this child move in her womb. But we have a lot of other things going on here. We have the visitation, that's the main story, but we have behind the visitation all of these subsidiary scenes, which I'm going to take you through. And then we have these two saints who are very important, right in the foreground, St. Nicholas and St. Anthony Abbot. So let's first look at some of the back scenes. When you look at this painting, it's almost every story, every part of the Christmas story is almost told in this one painting. So for example, in the far right of the painting, back here, what you find is this view of architecture in churches going back to the hillside. And on one of these churches is a fresco of the Annunciation. So Piero actually depicts a painting in the painting of the Annunciation. Probably he shows it as a painting because it would have already taken place by the time of the visitation. So it's history. So you could paint a fresco because it's history. So there's that. You look to the left in the painting and you see the nativity and the adoration of the shepherds. Then if you go up the hill, here come the Magi on their way. So this is all right here. And then we come to this scene on the far right, and that's the massacre of the innocents. That is what prompts Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt, the flight into Egypt. So Herod has decreed that the children shall be massacred. They're all being stabbed and killed. One child is falling off the ledge. This little lamb is trying to escape. So this is the massacre of the innocents. It's all there for us to sort of partake of. And then that gets us to the saints. These guys are great. I mean, yeah, it's hard to beat these two guys. They're really quite something. So first we have, let's take St. Anthony Abbot, who we see here on the right. St. Anthony has a particularly important role to play. He was the patron saint. He was the founder of monasticism, but he's the patron saint of a particular monastic order, and they were known as the Hospitallers of St. Anthony. His monks, his brethren, his order treated people with incurable disease, like the plague and other kinds of disease. So he and his brethren moved into poor cities, and they ministered to the poor who were suffering from these horrific, incurable diseases. The disease that becomes associated with St. Anthony, today we call St. Anthony's fire. And St. Anthony's fire was the disease that came from the result of eating infected grain products, rye, and it was called ergotism. That's what it's called. Its scientific name is ergotism, E-R-G-O-T. And by eating these infected, you wouldn't know this was infected until you had baked it in bread and then you ate it. And this caused a horrific, it was a painful skin disease. And it's associated, nobody wanted to minister to these people. And Anthony was one of the few who did. He was able to, in order to keep his charity and his ministry sort of going, he did need to raise some funds. So he asked the Pope if it would be okay for his order to raise swine. And they said, okay. So one of his attributes is the pig. And then this carries into the fact that because everybody always saw him with pigs, he was walking around with a pig all the time. People who actually raised pigs, swineherds, they thought, wow, this guy really loves pigs. Maybe he should be our patron saint. So Anthony Abbot is also the patron saint beyond the monastic side of him. He's the patron saint of swineherds, people who raise pigs for a living. He has certain attributes. He's shown here with his inkwell and writing, his quill. He carries a staff that is a distinctive kind of cross. It's not a Greek cross, it's not a Latin cross. It's the cross that's in the shape of a T, and that's called a Tau cross, T-A-U. That's what you see here. He has a bell, because whenever you're dealing with plague and plague victims, you have to warn people if you're bringing these people out into some place that these are people with plague because of contagion. The pig is back here. And then we have one of the most beautiful portrayals in Renaissance art of glasses. And these are exactly these are Renaissance glasses. We have examples of them in museums that have survived. So there he's wearing his wonderful glasses. Then we come to the other side, and we have St. Nicholas. Now, St. Nicholas's history is a little bit different. He's from Turkey. He's the Bishop of Myra in the 4th century in Turkey. And he too has a book. And this one we can actually read, so we know what exactly he's reading. He's reading from the Book of Wisdom, which is sometimes called the Wisdom of Solomon. And this is a book of the Bible, so it does have that lineage. But in Catholicism, it's considered canon, but it's considered what they call second canon, which means it's not quite as exalted as the other books of the Bible. Protestants, though, consider the Book of Wisdom as apocrypha, but they think it's good enough to read nonetheless. So it's a book that has a lot of good things in it, and even if it's apocrypha, we should probably read it. What he's open to is the beginning of the Book of Wisdom, and it's the line that says, quote, "Love justice, you who judge the earth. Think of the Lord in goodness, and seek him in integrity of heart." Now, Nicholas's attribute, we have Anthony, he's got the pig and the cross and the bell and all of that. What we have with Nicholas's attribute are these 3 gold balls. There are actually 2 here, one behind the other, and this one. You always see him near or with 3 golden balls. Sometimes he's actually holding them in a little tray, things like that. And this relates to one of his most famous miracles. Anthony was concerned with the monastic orders, with his order. Nicholas was concerned with children and with taking care of children, ministering to children, charity to children, especially orphan children, So almost all of his miracles relate to something he did for children. And in this particular case, the story of the golden balls is that in Myra there was a man, he had lost his wife, he was trying to raise 3 daughters, he had no money. He had no money for a dowry for his daughters, so the chances are that they would grow up and have to go into a life of prostitution or whatever. It was a horrible future that they would probably have. Nicholas hears about the plight of this man and his daughters, and so one night he comes to the house. The children are in their beds, are getting ready to go to bed. They take off their shoes and stockings and put them down by the bed. While they're asleep, Nicholas comes to the outside of the room. Today he'd be arrested as a stalker. He climbs up and he takes 3 golden balls, one at a time, and he throws them through the window, and each one goes into one of the stockings of the kids. Like Michael Jordan, boom, boom, boom. The kids wake up, the girls wake up, and in their stockings are these golden balls. The father's delighted, this is their dowry now, because these are very valuable, and it's a happy story. My favorite portrayal of this story is a painting that's at the Met in New York. It's this one. This is by Bici di Lorenzo. It's St. Nicholas providing dowries from 1433 to 35. This is one of my favorite paintings at the Metropolitan. He's climbing up here. He needs actually a rock to get high enough. And then he's throwing the balls through. She's taking off her stockings here. So that shows that particular miracle. The other miracle he's most famous for is even better. I'm not going to show you any images, but it's the miracle of the pickled boys. This is a story in Myra of an evil shopkeeper during a plague. There's a famine, and he hates kids, and he kidnaps 3 young boys, and he takes an axe and he chops them up, and he puts their body parts into barrels of brine to pickle them, and and then he's going to, I'm just the messenger here, and then he is going to sell, he's either going to eat some himself or sell them during the famine. And so St. Nicholas gets wind of this and comes to the shop, and he performs a miracle where he makes the boys whole again, and they come they come rising out of these 3 barrels, sort of like the Marx Brothers in Duck Soup. They come rising out of these barrels, and they're singing Alleluia. And that's the other great miracle. That thing, though, that story becomes very popular in the 20th century. Does anybody know why? It's used by Benjamin Britten in 1948 when he writes an oratorio called the St. Nicholas Cantata. He uses that story. And in the 20th century, through Benjamin Britten's music, that story started to get a much wider sort of, shall we say, following. Now, one other thing, though, to mention here, there's another little attribute right in the front. Anything that's always right pushed into the front in your face, sort of, you know it's not there accidentally. So here we have an example of a wallflower. And a wallflower has 2 different connotations. It symbolizes divine love, that's one aspect. But a more practical role for it was that since antiquity, wallflowers were used to make an herbal remedy that would ease the pain of childbirth. So women who were undergoing labor or pains in childbirth would have a concoction that they would drink based on crushing up wallflower to make a kind of herbal remedy. So that's a reference to the fact that both of these ladies are, of course, pregnant. One other thing to mention about the golden balls that you again see here, and about this miracle. Today in Europe, almost throughout all of Europe, when children hang up their stockings, what they hope to find in the morning are 3 oranges. And the 3 oranges are symbolic of these 3 golden balls. So that's the tradition that continues today. And then the last thing to mention about, of course, St. Nicholas, he's associated with charity, children, of course, gift giving, the gold balls are gifts, etc. So when, and he's revered throughout all of Europe. He was particularly venerated in Holland by the Dutch. And so when the Dutch come to New York and come to the New World, of course, they bring him with them. And in Dutch, he is known as Sinterklaas, Sinterklaas. And Sinterklaas then in New York becomes Santa Claus once he's given a new form, not the form of the bishop, but the form of the Santa Claus that we know based on the drawing of Thomas Nast. So that's the translation and transition of Nicholas from Myra, Turkey. By the way, he's revered not just in Myra or in Turkey, but also in Italy, in Bari, in southern Italy. And that's because after he dies, the Italians want to venerate him. And so they go to Turkey and dig up his grave, and they steal some bones. And they bring those bones back to Italy. They bring them to Bari, and they build a whole cathedral around the bones. And so today you can go to Bari. He's venerated in these two places, in Turkey and also now in Italy, because the Italians stole his bones so they could have relics. You love these stories, right? They're great. I mean, you know, you gotta. Okay, here's something new. This we have talked about. We've talked about adoration of the shepherds, and I've read you the passages. And now we're into, this would be if you were following our galleries, we're a little bit deeper into the space. We're in gallery number 23. It's actually the room more or less devoted to Titian, but we have some other works on the walls, and this is one of them. This is by Giovanni Savoldo. Savoldo is a Brescian painter. He's from Brescia. This is the Adoration of the Shepherds, 1530s. Now something new. It's a nocturnal scene. It's at night. And now what you begin to see is this implication of Jesus as light. Now he is the source, literally in these paintings, most nocturnal scenes, he is the source of light coming from the painting. We have a number of things here. He's sort of emanating light, casting this sort of light and dark shadow here. This up here in the corner, which is hard to read, is actually the Annunciation to the shepherds. So again, we have both. The announcement to the shepherds to seek out the child, and then they seek out the child and find him here. And now Jesus is starting to look like a little light bulb. I mean, he's actually casting, he's actually the source of light. But the thing I love about this painting are these gestures by this shepherd here, because it looks like Jesus isn't just light, he's heat as well, that he's kind of warming his hands here. Now here we have the more traditional three shepherds. We didn't have that in Giorgione. We had two shepherds. Here we have three. And this is definitely a younger shepherd. These two guys actually look pretty close in age, but I guess this one might be older than this one here. And then the Christ child radiating light. Now this concept of the nocturnal nativity or adoration starts in the north, and this is one of the most important examples. This is a painting by Geerten tot Sint Jans. I love that name. This is from the National Gallery in London. It's the Nativity of Night at Night from 1490. And here you see this nocturnal scene, the Christ child, the shepherds. Up here, there's a detail, the announcement to the shepherds out in the fields up here. This is one of the most important prototypes of the nocturnal scene of the Nativity. Now, what is going on here? Why all of a sudden this bright light, Jesus emanating light? What's happening here? And here we come now to the third. We've talked about St. Jerome, St. Francis. This is St. Bridget of Sweden. St. Bridget of Sweden is the one who begins to equate Jesus with light. Now, there is a scriptural source, not about the baby Jesus, but there is a scriptural source of this. It's John 8:12, where we read, "Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." That's Jesus as an adult saying that. But in any case, there is that equation. But it's really St. Bridget's writing. So what is she saying? Well, St. Bridget is a mystic saint. So she's comparable in Sweden to St. Teresa of Avila in Spain. And as a mystic, mystics tend to have revelations, and in these revelations, they're present. It's not like they have a dream that they're not in. They're actually in it, so they're present. So St. Bridget dies in 1373, but her revelations are actually published posthumously. But one of the most famous passages in her revelations is this story of the birth of Jesus. And once this got common currency, artists just began to really take it up. So here's what, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's among the things she says. When I was present, see, she's present, she was there. When I was present by the manger of the Lord in Bethlehem, I beheld a virgin of extreme beauty, wrapped in a white mantle and a delicate tunic, through which I perceived her virginal body. With her was an old man, poor Joseph, of great honesty, and they had with them an ox and an ass. These entered the cave, and the man, having tied them to the manger, went out and brought into the virgin a lighted candle, which having done, he again went outside, so as not to be present at the birth. Joseph is not even at the birth. He's like out having a cigarette, comes back, it's all done. Then she goes on about Mary beginning to disrobe in preparation, and then she says, her beautiful golden hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Of course it's golden hair, she's Swedish. Then we go on to the actual moment, right? According to St. Bridget. Suddenly, in a moment, she gave birth to her own son, from whom radiated such ineffable light and splendor that the sun was not comparable to it, while the divine light totally annihilated the material light of St. Joseph's candle. That's the important passage where she says, such ineffable light and splendor that the sun was not comparable to it. Then she goes on, I saw the glorious infant lying on the ground, naked and shining. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that this is a child naked and shining? It's light, but then it goes on, she goes on to say this, which is even more fulfilling of what we're talking about. Naked and shining, whining and trembling from the cold and hardness of the floor. Why would it be whining and trembling? If you get cold, what are you? Human. It's the incarnation. This is a child who is also man. He's subject to heat, to cold, to hard floors. So that's very, very important. And then we go, and then it says, when all this was done, the old man entered. So Joseph comes back. In no way was here's the important thing now, remember the Duccio reclining? Okay, now here's where it changes. In no way was the virgin changed by giving birth. The color of her face remained the same, nor did her strength decline. She and Joseph put the child in the manger and worshiped him on their knees with immense joy until the arrival of the kings who recognized the son from the likeness to his mother. With that passage, what St. Bridget is saying is that this birth was instantaneous, it was painless, and it in no way affected the virgin's health, demeanor. She wasn't disheveled, whatever. As soon as the kid came out, she's ready to worship it, and that's what Joseph and Mary do, which is what leads to images like this. This is what we're more familiar with. This is right after the birth. Mary is beautifully coiffed. Every hair is in place. No problem. No, I'm kind of tired. I could use a drink. Gee, I wish I had a red mattress. No, she's right there, the Christ child. Joseph is back here sleeping. Joseph sleeps through the whole thing. So with St. Bridget, we get the new paradigm. And that's the paradigm we all know, especially in your little creche scene, where they're kneeling, praying, everything looks good. That comes from St. Bridget. This is by Piero di Cosimo, by the way. Now, remember back here, we talked about the shepherds, and I mentioned to you that normally there are three shepherds to kind of mirror three magi, and that's the case. And then I mentioned that normally they're shown at different ages and different ways, and that's why I want to mention something here. This is not a painting we own, I wish we did. This is at the Uffizi in Florence, and this is the famous Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes from 1477-78. It's a gigantic painting. It's almost the size of this front room, the wall, a little bit smaller. And you'll notice the adoration here, the Christ child, all of that, symbolic ideas here of the plants and all that. But what I want you to look at are the three shepherds right here. These three shepherds come to adore the child. And here they are a little bit closer up. This is a fascinating paradigm now. We have three shepherds, three different ages, but not just three different ages. We now have three different almost states of being. For example, the youngest shepherd is this guy in the back. And he has the most, for lack of a better phrase, dull-witted look on his face, like he doesn't really understand anything. He's standing. He still is holding his tools, his hoe. He's closed off. He's in a closed pose. His hat's towards his chest. We come to the next shepherd, who is the next in age. He's older. His face is more refined. He's not standing. He's not kneeling. He's sort of leaning towards the child with his hands open. Now he seems to be gaining awareness of what this child represents. Then we come to the oldest shepherd. The oldest shepherd has the most beautiful face. He kneels. He's in a devotional pose. And geographically, he's the closest to the child. So with each subsequent movement through the shepherds, we get a growing awareness of the divinity of Christ through their body language, their facial type, and their pose. This is very, very typical. This painting was, the Portinari altarpiece was painted by a Flemish painter, a Netherlandish painter, Hugo van der Goes. And it's called the Portinari altarpiece because Tommaso Portinari was a banker for the Medici who was stationed in Bruges. He commissioned this painting to be painted. When he finished his time in Bruges, he brought the painting back to Florence with him. Once Florentine artists saw these shepherds, especially, they had never seen this kind of realism before. And you start to see Ghirlandaio and other Florentine painters in their nativity scenes, all of a sudden the shepherds look like they came right out of this painting. This is the way information could travel in this time. Sometimes an artist would go to a work of art. Sometimes the work of art would come to the artist. So this is a very important moment in Florentine art history. This is a work I'm not going to talk about. It's the Annunciation to the Shepherds by a Venetian, Jacopo Bassano. Just to show you the effect of this realism, even up in the Veneto, you begin to see this realistic treatment, this kind of gruff imagery of the shepherds. This is a Petrus Christus Netherlandish painting, the Nativity, and I want to talk about or just mention a few things here. We're not going to spend a lot of time. This is from 1450. Here are stones. Notice how prominent?
Yeah.
So you have to kind of step over those stones to even get into the picture. We have hieratic scale here. The more important you are, the bigger you are, right? Mary, Joseph. Notice Joseph has his shoes kicked off. These are his clogs because he's standing on holy ground. So when Moses approaches the burning bush, he's told to remove his shoes. Here's the trussing of the stable, right? Lots of Trinity stuff going on here, right? We have Adam and Eve in this fictive architecture. Adam and Eve, Old Testament, right? And they're standing on these columns. And these poor guys down here, these guys are us. Because what these guys represent is the weight of original sin bearing down on us. It deforms us, it hurts us, it's a burden. So we have that idea here. Also the typology, of course, Old Testament, New Testament is evident enough. And then look back here. This is the manger back here. The ox is eating, the ox is looking and the ass is eating. The food is up here. So he's eating from up there. This is the shelf with the hay. And so it's the same idea that we mentioned before. So we have all those elements that are present here. Just to illustrate another type of Magi depiction, I mentioned the different ages, the different states of being, reasonableness, experience, enthusiasm. These are the three geographic ideas. This is Europe, Asia, and Africa, right? This is a painting by Juan de Flandes, Adoration of the Magi from around 1508. So here we have that characterization. This is the European magus, the Asian. The Asian is Asian because he wears this hat that looks exotic. That's about the extent of his Asian connection. And the African magus here. And then they hold three gifts that were mentioned in Scripture that I already read to you: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All three of these gifts are the gifts of kingship. So gold, being presented by the European, gold is a valuable, and it refers to earthly kingship. And then frankincense is a perfume, and it is the reference to the deity of kingship. And then myrrh is an ointment or an oil, and that is used to anoint the dead bodies of kings before burial. So all of those gifts relate to the kingship of Jesus. Now, this is one of the most important paintings, and unfortunately, this season, this is off view because we've loaned it out to another museum, so you won't be able to see this in the galleries, but it's important. This is by Adrian Issenbrandt. It's called The Adoration of the Shepherds. Okay, we've already talked about that. It's from 1520, but it has a lot going on. So here's Mary and Joseph paying their respects to the Christ child. Here, the angels, hieratic scale we just mentioned. Here's the adoration of the shepherds. They're playing musical instruments here. So they're all coming in to adore the child. But once again, looking way back here, is the annunciation to the shepherds. So we have both ideas again. So the angel announcing to the shepherds, and then they're coming to find the child here. We have all kinds of reference. Here's the stones again, right? Here's these big shafts of wheat to make bread in the Eucharist, the body of Christ. So there's that element here. Now there's something very different here. This Christ child, back here, the Christ child was again on the garment of the Virgin. That's strictly Brigantine. It relates directly to St. Bridget. So that keeps disseminating. Here, the child is not on the ground. It's not on the garment of the Virgin, and he's on a basket that's upturned. It's upside down. So this is an upside down basket on which is the cloth, which we see the Christ child and then the parents in this adoration. What's probably going on here is the portrayal of Jesus in the concept of what's known as a corpus verum, the true body of Christ that is celebrated at the Mass. What is going on here is a Mass. This is the first worshiping of Jesus on the altar, probably by his parents. And it is in the corpus verum, that's the true body of Jesus. So that's probably what's theologically happening here, which explains this basket that you see down here. We have the temple. We saw this with Botticelli. We saw it with Fra Angelico. This looks like a very ornate temple, but it is crumbling nonetheless. It's falling apart. Weeds are growing in between it. Things are falling down. Here's this reference to the stable, right? Same thing we had in the Botticelli. Here's a statue that's above the arch. The statue is of Moses. Now here we have another typology. The typology here is that Jesus is the new Moses. And in the case of the two of them, they were both teachers, prophets, and lawgivers. And Jesus supplants Moses in the New Testament. So there's the same typology here. But then we go back here, and that's what I've made a detail of on the right, and I've tried to blow it up a bit so you can see it. Through this arcade and way off into the distance, on one side we see the Annunciation to the shepherds, but on the other side we see something very different. And what we see is a group of people dancing around a bonfire, a huge bonfire, and they're dancing around it. Now, what is going on here? This is not canon. It's not scriptural. It's not apocryphal. It's not the Golden Legend. It's not the writing of a saint. What this probably is folkloric. And what it refers to now is this idea that with the dying of the light, in other words, it relates to the pagan ideas of the winter solstice. The December 21st is the winter solstice. It's the darkest day of the year, the shortest day of the year. And in northern ritual, pagan ritual, there was this fear of the losing of the light, right? And so in order to prevent this from happening, or at least to stave it off, there were these huge ritual bonfires, and in fact, even logs that were on fire were brought into the home as a Yule log to try to keep the light going. Even things that were evergreen, right, were brought into the house that wouldn't die through the winter. All of that is probably being referred to here, but more importantly, what's being referred to here is what I teased you with way back at the beginning, and that is the calendar. Now, how did we end up with December 25th as the birthday of Jesus? And this painting is probably dealing with that idea. So, what are we talking about? Well, you have to go back to the early origins of Christianity, and I'm sure you know that even in the early days, it wasn't even called Christianity. After the death of Jesus, it was called the Jesus movement. And you had all kinds of different ideas about what Christianity was. Everybody had an opinion. It should be this, it should be that, we should follow this, we should follow that. Peter had one set of ideas about when would we become Christian. Paul had another set of ideas. All of these things are in debate and in flux, and it's especially in the 4th century that this is taking place. And so what happens eventually in 313 is the so-called Edict of Milan, when the Emperor Constantine supposedly converts to Christianity. It might have been just a political thing on his deathbed. In any case, with the Edict of Milan in 313, he recognizes Christianity as one, not exclusively, as one of the recognized official religions of the Roman Empire, which means Christians can come up from the underground. They can come up from the catacombs and worship in the open without fear of persecution. Well, that only recognizes one religion among many other pagan religions that are still in currency, like Mithraism, sacrificing bulls, all this other stuff. So that's the way it goes. You have Christianity now vying with all these other pagan religions. And now it is, well, what are we going to do to fulfill and to solidify Christianity? Well, it might be nice to have a holiday. It might be nice to know when Jesus was born. So we could have a kind of a celebration of that. So that's when this debate begins to take place. What is the birthday of Jesus? What's the major Roman holiday? The major Roman holiday is Saturnalia. And Saturnalia runs from roughly the 17th of December through the 24th. This is the most favorite Roman holiday. It's based on gift giving, parents to children. Masters serve their servants during Saturnalia. They flip their roles. All of this. This is a big, big pagan party. Okay, if we just say to the pagans, to the Romans, no more Saturnalia, there'll be revolution. So we can't do that. This is too popular. So they can have Saturnalia, but maybe we should graft onto that the birth of Jesus somewhere in that vicinity. So we can't do it in the 17th through the 24th. That's too pagan. Let's do it on the 25th, right after Saturnalia. Then we'll have both of these holidays, in essence, coexisting. So if you're pagan, you can celebrate Saturnalia. Great. If you're Christian, you can celebrate the birth of Jesus. And let's hope that over time, there'll be more adherence to Christianity than to paganism, and one will just kind of go by the wayside, Saturnalia, and the other will become the official kind of holiday. And that's exactly what happened over time. But that still needed the official imprimatur of the Pope. So 313 is the Edict of Milan. We come to 350, or almost 40 years later, whatever. Pope Julius I, not Julius II, who's later with Michelangelo, Julius I announces officially that December 25th is the birth date of Jesus. Even with that, the next pope, Liberius I, thinks, I don't know if that's going to hold. So I better reinforce that. And 3 years later, in 353, Liberius I adds his weight to it and says, yes, that is now considered by two popes to be the birth date of Jesus, December 25th. What happens in 380? 380, we have a triumvirate of emperors, not one, but three. The most important is Theodosius the first. And in 380, so 313, 380, we have Theodosius issue the Edict of Thessalonica, in which he now makes Christianity the only official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, if you're not Christian, you're a heretic. So between 313 and 380, right in the middle, is when Christmas is sort of determined to be December 25th. And it ties right into what we see here with this idea of the solstice, and with the idea, what would stave off the darkness of the solstice? Jesus' light. We don't need to worry anymore about the darkness because Jesus is light. And that's how it all kind of comes together. So this is a particularly important painting. And then we come to the most beautiful painting, maybe, of all these paintings. This is one of the most beautiful paintings in the National Gallery. And it gets us back to something else now. This is the subject I alluded to earlier. This is the rest on the flight into Egypt. Not the flight into Egypt, but the rest. And it's by Gerard David, a Netherlandish painter from around 1510. This is one of the most drop-dead gorgeous paintings in the National Gallery, especially if you like blue. The treatment of blue in this picture is remarkable. You know, there have been entire books written about the color blue, but this painting it would stand up to any other painting of blue. Now here we have a story, the rest on the flight into Egypt, that is not canon. There's no reference in the Gospels to the rest on the flight into Egypt. The flight into Egypt is in Matthew, but not that they took a rest on their way. So in that case, this is Apocrypha. And it comes from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, the Pseudo-Matthew Gospel. And this passage in Pseudo-Matthew, I'm not sure why this didn't make the cut, because this is one of the most beautiful passages you'll read that tells this story that was then read by artists and who knew about this story. So here I'm going to read you the section in Pseudo-Matthew, it's chapter 20, that essentially is what's illustrated here by Gerard David. And it came to pass on the third day of their journey, while they were walking, that the Blessed Mary was fatigued by the excessive heat of the sun in the desert. And seeing a palm tree, she said to Joseph, "Let me rest a little under the shade of this tree." Joseph therefore made haste and led her to the palm, and made her come down from her beast. And as the Blessed Mary was sitting there, she looked up to the foliage of the palm, and saw it full of fruit, and said to Joseph, "I wish it were possible to get some of the fruit of this palm." And Joseph said to her, "I wonder that thou sayest this, when thou seest how high the palm tree is." In other words, I'm not climbing up there. "And that thou thinkest of eating of its fruit. I am thinking more of the want of water, because the skins are now empty, and we have none wherewith to refresh ourselves and our cattle." Then the child Jesus, with a joyful countenance, reposing in the bosom of his mother, said to the palm, "O tree, bend thy branches, and refresh my mother with thy fruit." And immediately at these words, the palm bent its top down to the very feet of the Blessed Mary, and they gathered from it fruit with which they were all refreshed. And after they had gathered all its fruit, it remained bent down, waiting the order to rise from him who had commanded it to stoop. Then Jesus said to it, "Raise thyself, O palm tree, and be strong, and be the companion of my trees, which are in the paradise of my Father, and open from thy roots a vein of water, which has been hid in the earth, and let the waters flow, so that we may be satisfied from thee." And it rose up immediately, and at its root there began to come forth a spring of water, exceedingly clear and cool and sparkling. And when they saw the spring of water, they rejoiced with great joy, and were satisfied, themselves and all their cattle and their beasts. Wherefore they gave thanks to God. How that didn't make the cut, I don't know. That's a gorgeous, gorgeous passage, even in translation. It's especially beautiful in terms of the dialogue of Jesus talking to the trees. I think that's incredibly beautiful. But now we can see that obviously Gerard David took a lot of liberties with this story. First of all, we're not in a desert. We're in Northern Europe. He's Netherlandish. They probably have never seen a date palm up there. So the tree that's in the painting on the far right is not a palm tree, it's a chestnut tree. We have other elements here. We have Mary with the Christ child, and here we have the Christ child holding grapes. So in the Isenbrand painting, we had the shafts of wheat for the body of Christ. Here we have the grapes for the blood of Christ in the Eucharist. This rock outcrop is covered with this beautiful fine moss that the donkey loves. The burro here is eating all this. The reference is to go to that tree and it'll bend down. He's taking liberties there, but what's great is there is this idea that Joseph isn't going up any tree. So Joseph goes to this chestnut tree, and what does he do? He takes a big stick and starts beating on the tree to have the chestnuts fall so that he can then feed his wife and his child. They're resting. Here is their picnic basket, here. And then right in the foreground, and again, this is not an accident, are all these very specific plants, all of which have symbolic meaning. So let's get a little closer. One of the most beautiful passages in this painting is just the hands here. And this painting is maybe, I don't know, a little bit bigger than a sheet of notebook paper. This is an incredible delicacy here, the parallelism here, the transparency of the veil, all of this. Here's Joseph banging on the tree over here. I love this peach fuzz hair for the child. And then it's just this symphony of blue. The shades of blue, there are dozens of shades of blue throughout this picture. We come to the foreground, and here is the basket, and here are these plants. Now again, once they're pushed into your face like that, they're not accidental. We're supposed to identify them, and they're supposed to have and do have symbolic connotations. So reading from left to right, this plant here is plantain, and plantain had the connotation of being used to staunch blood, like we might use a cotton ball. You would take plantain and crumble it up to staunch a wound, and that refers, of course, clearly to the Passion of Christ. A mint is next. That's the next plant. Mint is symbolic of virtue. Then there's a red strawberry plant, symbolic of the blood of the Passion again. There's a three-leafed fern, and these leaves have points. They look like little swords. The three-leaf fern is, first of all, it's three leaves, which is the Trinity, and because it's pointed like a sword, it's meant to ward off the devil. And then the very last plant over here are violets, and violets are symbolic of humility. We still use the term, she's a shrinking violet, that kind of idea. But all of these ideas refer either to the Jesus, to his ultimate fate, or to the attributes of Mary, her humility and her virtue. Then in the corner, we have the spring that's opening up to allow water now. And you have to look very carefully, but there's a bubbling of water in the very corner. This painting is among the most beautiful portrayals of this particular story, so much so that I know I appreciate your patience, that in the realm of music, I always end this talk in the galleries by referring to a piece of music, but I don't play it, obviously. But now I can play it for you and also because it relates in some ways to this picture specifically. The excerpt I'm going to play is from Hector Berlioz's L'Enfance du Christ, the childhood of Christ, and it's an early Berlioz work. Here is Hector Berlioz here on the left. When you look at art directors and they have to choose a cover for CDs for this particular recording, 9 times out of 10 they choose our painting. They choose the Gerard David as the cover art for the CD box. L'Enfance du Christ is written between 1853 and 54. It's Berlioz work, unlike other Berlioz works. It doesn't have the bombast and the sort of pyrotechnics of what we normally associate with Berlioz. Berlioz was essentially agnostic, if not atheist, but this particular work is a very moving work, and it's one of the most significant in terms of religious music. It's not played as often as like the Messiah and other works that we are more familiar with, but he called it a sacred trilogy, you can see up here. Berlioz referred to this as a sacred trilogy. It's in 3 parts. The first part is the Massacre of the Innocents, the second part is the flight into Egypt, and the third part is the arrival in Egypt, where they're rebuffed initially as refugees. They're rebuffed by an Egyptian family, by a Roman family, and then they're finally accepted by an Ishmaelite family so that they have a refuge. This, I'm going to play you just from the central part. If anybody knows this music, it's the chorus, one of the choruses that they know, and this is the chorus that the words are here, and this is the shepherd's farewell. As the Holy Family is about to flee into Egypt, the shepherds gather around them to sing farewell to them. This is one of the most famous choruses, I think, certainly in any in Western music, certainly any Christmas music. Once the shepherds, once the family departs, then you have a narrator, a tenor, who sings about the rest on the flight into Egypt. And he sings, in essence, about what is in the painting that we just looked at, what is happening, how they sit there, how they're resting, etc. And it ends with this sort of hallelujah. So we're going to go ahead and dim the lights, play the chorus. From the chorus, we're going to in the work, in the oratorio, from the chorus it goes right into the narrator singing about the rest. So there's just a brief pause as the conductor goes on to the next part. This is James Conlon, who's the director of the Los Angeles Opera, and it's a performance of the National French Orchestra, and it takes place in Saint-Denis, the great Basilica of Saint-Denis, outside of Paris. It used to be outside of Paris, now it's part of Paris almost. So it's a gorgeous setting for this performance. So here we go.
Seigneur, pour mon fils, au désert l'étendue, au désert l'étendue. Puis étant assis sous l'ombrage de trois palmiers au vert feuillage, l'âne paissant, l'enfant dormant, les sacrés voyageurs, quelque temps sans bercés par des songes heureux, et les anges du ciel à genoux autour d'eux. Le divin enfant
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a happy holiday and a Merry Christmas.